I'm Yoram Perry, the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. This event has been done by two organizations, both by the Israel Studies program and the Chinese program, the Confucius Institute. And I'm happy to see so many people, in spite of the fact that we have such a weather. I thought it would be only the guests from Israel and myself. But it's wonderful to see you all, and probably even the sun works for us, so that is wonderful. The dean of the Confucius Institute, Donna Weissman, apologized that she couldn't arrive because she's stuck in some airport or somewhere. So she's with us in spite of the fact that she's not here, and she'll be able to watch us on the screen because we put our lectures on our site. So you are invited to watch yourself on the site as well. I was thinking of a very short introduction, and only one thought across my mind, and that is that in Syria, people are still continue to be massacred. Yesterday, today, probably tomorrow. The entire world is watching now Kiev and Crimea. But we are at the university are lucky enough to be able to get 2 steps back or to the side and to look into other topics which are not so dramatic as the ones that people who watch television and read newspapers do. And this is exactly what we do today. We can take a few steps at the side to look into a very interesting phenomena, relations, comparative approach to 2 national movements, something that I'm sure no journalist will cover today. It won't appear tomorrow on the Washington Post. And nevertheless, it's very important. And we have a wonderful person to present that topic, because there aren't very many, maybe there is no one else who can do it as good as Dr. Aaron Shai can. Dr. Aaron Shai was born in Jerusalem. He studied history and philosophy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and also MA in history. And he did his PhD in the at Oxford University. He worked for years on the relations between Britain and China. His PhD was on the relations between the 2 states in the 30s, during the Second China-Japan War. He wrote, since then, very many books on similar topics. I'll just mention a few of them. The Origins of War in the East, Britain, China, Japan, 1937, 1939. China in International Affairs, 1840, 1990. Britain and China, 1941, 1947, which he called Imperial Momentum. The Fate of British and French Firms in China, 1949, 1957, Imperialism Imprisoned. 20th Century China, that book was in Hebrew, I think, wasn't that? Yes. 20th Century China. Lately, he wrote a fascinating book on a person whom I knew a little bit about, but I cannot pronounce his name. Zhang Shua Liang? Wonderful. Pretty close. Good. The General Who Never Fought. And we have the book here in English. He was a very interesting figure in the Chinese history of the 20th century, including being a governor of Manchuria. That's the book. And it was already published in Japanese as well. Chinese, sorry. Oh.
What a mistake.
Yeah. So these are the books. Professor Shai is the provost of Tel Aviv University. He was the chair of the history department and built really the program of East Asia studies at the university in Tel Aviv. I can continue to talk for another 10 minutes about his achievements in this field, but I believe that it will be a waste of time. You will hear from the lecture that he really knows both the Chinese history and Jewish history and Israeli history. So we let the podium, I will free the podium for him. Please,
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Shai.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. If you want to have a look, I mean, those who read Chinese can have it, if not the English ones while I'm talking. Yes, thank you very much, Yoram. I mean, normally people say that, had my mother listened to you, she would have believed you. But in my case, it wouldn't have been like that because she said, no, that's not true. Anyway, so I'm very glad to be here. In fact, I have two very old friends here, Yoram Perry and Professor Jonathan Wilkenfeld, and we know each other for decades upon decades. And it's, in fact, my third visit here as a lecturer. I mean, to deliver a lecture. I came here several times, and I'm very glad that our universities also have strong contacts on various projects. And I hope it will continue with that. And, of course, I'm very glad at being myself the chair of the committee of the Confucius Committee at Tel Aviv University. I'm very glad that we have got friends here from the Confucius Institute here, which is one of the most, the oldest, I think, in the world. Now, my assignment was not very easy. In fact, I contemplated, because one time I talked about education in Israel about 4 or 5 years ago. Then I talked about Sino-Israeli relations. But this time I decided to talk about the Jewish and the Chinese national movements. And as for the subtitle, I didn't have any idea, and I just wrote a few observations. But as I prepared this and everything was printed, I thought maybe I can also subtitle the lecture from subjugation to self-assertion and to hubris as well. And I'll explain it towards the end of my lecture. Anyway, it isn't at all easy to address members of both the CI and the GIIS, the Israeli Studies, and draw their attention to common theme. How can one place, that's the question, Chinese modern affairs and Israeli contemporary political developments in the same basket? Yet, if one looks at the historical events of the past, let's say, 120 years or so, and I would say even from 1897 to the present, one can see remarkable similarities between the Jewish national movement, Zionism, and the modern Chinese national movement, be it under the cloak of Kuomintang or disguised as part of the communist creed. In other words, nationalism can wear many guises. These may sometimes be confusing. I mentioned 1897 because in 1897, Theodor Herzl, in fact, the leader, the inventor, in fact, of Zionism, assembled the first Zionist Congress, and Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, arrived in Japan and, in fact, created soon afterwards the Tungmenhui, the association which actually served as the very seed, the very basis for Chinese nationalism in the 20th century. In the case, but I say there are many guises there, and in the case of Zionism too, not only in the case of the Chinese national movement, but also in the case of the Jewish national movement, Zionism, one can talk about different faces, different forms of that movement. Even in Zionism, one can talk about the national or the nationalist movement, and the idea took on many forms: socialist, Marxist, religious, liberal, and even semi-fascist. But let me first review very briefly the historical background. Very briefly, I would just want to remind ourselves that following the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the end of the theocratic Jewish state by the Roman legions in 70 AD, the Jewish people was scattered throughout the world. Only in the 19th century, against the menacing background of growing anti-Semitism in Europe and proliferation of nationalist movements, did the modern Jewish national movement of Zionism arise, culminating, in fact, in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. The new state was formed by a very small minority of the world's Jewish population. Even today, most Jews live outside Israel. Many non-Israeli Jews do not regard Zionism as the appropriate or, for that matter, sole solution to what a century ago Europeans called the Jewish problem. Here I would like to point out that there is a difference between Jews living outside Israel, who, I emphasize, do not necessarily regard Israel as their national home, even if many of them sympathize with it, and the Chinese living outside China, who are often referred to as the Jews of the Far East, and always regard China in what we call in Chinese Guojia, that is the mother or the homeland. These points should be emphasized. When speaking of Guojia, we must make it clear that a comprehensive survey of the Jewish national movement and the Chinese national movement, or for that matter, even Sino-Israeli relations, needs to address not only the actual political entities such as Israel or the People's Republic of China or the Republic of China, i.e. Taiwan, Hong Kong, or even Singapore, but also more fluid, hard to define entities such as the overseas Chinese and diaspora Jewry. In other words, the relations between Chinese and Jews actually encompass so many other entities except the national ones that we recognize and think of. There is a fascinating history of relations between these two communities in exile. I'm now talking about Jews and Chinese outside of their Guojia, of their motherland. Relations marked by profound feelings of mutual esteem and even veneration. As successful minorities in North America, for example, and also in other countries, they often find themselves in similar situations, and they are certainly aware of the need to collaborate when facing threats such as xenophobia, and there were interesting cases of collaboration in Canada and in other places between these two communities. Now, however, our story harks back to their cultural similarities and dissimilarities with special relevance to their respective national movements. While the two people maintained strong religious, historical, and emotional ties with their motherlands, the Chinese, on the whole, enjoyed the privilege of remaining on Chinese soil. They were not, as a nation, exiled from their land, even if in the course of centuries many emigrated to nearby Asian countries or to distant lands. The experience of the Jews, as we know, was different. Almost all of them were forced out of their land and into exile. Hardly any Jews remained in Palestine. Those who did were assimilated into the tribes living in and around the Holy Land. This historical fact had momentous significance for the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel. I maintain that it was not easy for the Chinese to understand and internalize this uniquely Jewish experience. Initially, the question was raised as to why they even needed a homeland. The concept of return seemed rather strange, as did the Israeli law of return, which enabled every Jew to automatically become a citizen of the new state. When Abraham, the founder of our nation, left Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, and migrated to the land of Israel, around the year 1850 BC, China was ruled by the semi-mythological dynasty of Xia. And that is quite illuminating, I think it is quite illuminating, to actually try and compare milestones, different milestones in Jewish and Chinese history and dynasties in order to understand events, but we do this very rarely. For example, what happened in China during the destruction of the first temple, the exile, etc., but I shall not go into it, because normally we don't do it, but it does give a certain notion, a certain interesting insights when we talk about these two nations as a whole. Interestingly, in both the Hebrew or Israelite culture and the historical China, written language, the prerequisite for the survival and preservation of every nation and its traditions and development, had been well preserved for millennia, and this is something quite unique. This is very rare a phenomenon, and in most cases, except perhaps the Greek case. Now, language and tradition have undergone a classic, in other cases, classic metamorphosis, and the resultant identity is often a confusing mixture. This is not the case in Jewish and Chinese tradition. It is almost unbelievable that today, in the 21st century, we, Hebrew and Chinese speakers and writers, can still read and understand ethical, religious, and other texts written in China and Israel some 3,000 years ago. Moreover, in both cultures, the basic and extended family unit, various rituals, and traditional ceremonies have all been preserved to a surprising degree. The wisdom of the sages of both nations is well known. Mention should be made of Confucius, not only of Confucius Institute, but Confucius himself, Lao Tzu, Menze, and others. And of course, in the Hebrew tradition, the Bible, Talmud, Hillel, Shammai, and other well-known sages of the Hebrew tradition. Contemplation and the concept of learning, very interesting, I find, were cherished by both cultures. At the same time, waging war and fostering conflict was abhorrent in both. Here in America, one can watch and see young Jewish and Asian, many of them Chinese, actually taking hardly any important position in the army or navy, however, being quite extraordinary in the universities and research institutes. The Chinese have an idiom which says Hao Tie Budang Ding, Hao Budang Bing, which means that just as you do not cast nails from high quality metal, so you should never train high quality human beings, in this case, fine, intelligent young lads, to be soldiers. This is also the traditional Jewish idea. Maybe it has changed quite recently. When Confucius was asked what in one word is the essence of the gentleman's life, he replied, mutuality. According to our tradition, Hillel, the Jewish sage, categorically stated that one should not treat others in ways that one would not like to be treated. I shall not dwell on further similarities between the two civilizations. This is quite an interesting expedition, I find. But I would like to point out that the story of Sino-Jewish relations is also closely related to the Jewish presence in China. I am referring here to the famous Jewish community in Kaifang, in Henan, which apparently came into being during the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century and still exists today. The signification of Kaifang's Jews is a fantastic story in that it entails not only the adaptation of Confucius' ideas by the Jews, but also syncretism, in other words, a combination of Judaic and Confucius principles, which is less known but quite interesting. We could also spend time on the communities, Jewish communities in Harbin, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Inner Mongolia, Dongbei, Tianjin, and other places in sites that one cannot even dream of, Qingdao and so on. But I will not now move on to discuss the modern era, the 20th century. Prior to the formation of the PRC, of the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China, under the Kuomintang, had established relations with the founders of the Jewish state. These relations continued until after the State of Israel was declared in 1948. Nanjing, then the capital of China, was always sympathetic to Zionism. Developments would take a different turn following Jerusalem's recognition of the PRC, of the People's Republic of China, the communist regime, on January 9th, 1950. But I would like to remind ourselves, and again this is less known, that as early as April 24th, 1920, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Chinese national movement and the founder of New China, wrote to Nissim Elias Benjamin Ezra, the founder of the Shanghai Zionist Association. Indeed, there was a Zionist association in 1920 in Shanghai, expressing his sympathy for the Zionist movement. And he wrote the following, and I quote, "Chinese nationalism disappeared when China was conquered by the foreign Manchu. But China was not the only nation to have been conquered. The Jewish people also lost their country. Though their country was destroyed, the Jewish nation has existed to this day. Zionism is one of the greatest movements of the present time. All lovers of democracy cannot help but support the movement wholeheartedly, a movement aimed at restoring your wonderful and historic nation, which has contributed so much to the civilization of the world and which rightfully deserves an honorable place in the family of nations. This was a rare historical declaration. One of the leaders of China actually adhered here to Theodor Herzl's ideas. Herzl, as most of you know, was of course the apostle of Zionism, the Jewish national movement. And these two leaders, political philosophers, and nobody has done any work on the two or tried to compare the two, political philosophers, prophets, they were contemporaries. Both, in fact, brought their respective peoples from what I would call proto-nationalism to modern nationalism. This is, in fact, their main contribution. They were both born in the 1860s, and both were active in the 1890s, mainly, and the first year of the 20th century. Herzl died in 1904, while Sun actually survived and lived for another 20 years. They never met, of course, but Sun here expresses the classical Herzlian idea, and certainly they would have had a lot in common had they met. It is interesting to note that an analysis of 4 crucial periods in the 20th century, which I would like to dwell on quite briefly. Everything here is done really quite briefly just to whet the appetite. And I'm talking about the First World War, the period between the two wars, the turbulence of the Second World War, and the immediate post-Second World War era. If we look at these 4, they reveal, in fact, many similarities between the dilemmas faced by the architects of the two national movements at the two ends of the Asian continent. We should remember that prior to, or in fact during, as far as the Chinese are concerned, the Great War, both movements decided independently to join forces with the Entente and against the Central Powers, even though their reasons were slightly different. When we focus on the main issue, we realize that both the Chinese and the Jewish leaders entertained similar hopes. I'm referring to the expectation that in the emerging global situation, that is to say, immediately after the war, victory over the Central Powers was guaranteed. They believed so. Certainly in the event that the United States, as indeed happened, would join the Entente. We very often make a mistake. We say the Allies, but the Allies refers to the Second World War, not to the First. This was a calculated bet. Thus, a move towards the Entente powers held great promise for each of the national movements. What I'm saying here is that on top of what I hinted concerning Sun Yat-sen and Herzl and several proto-nationalist ideas, here we see a practical step taken relating to the First World War, to the Great War. The Jewish Yishuv, in other words, community in Palestine, entertained the hope of hosting the Ottoman Turks from the Holy Land and thus freeing the Jewish movement from the foreign yoke. Siding with the British was thus considered logical and desirable, even if quite daring in view of the Turks' quite cruel and despicable treatment of pro-British sentiments or traitors in Palestine. But nevertheless, the Jewish issue took this line, and I will not get in the Nili underground, etc., which is a separate story, especially in view of, and this is the crucial matter, of the November 1917 Balfour Declaration on the future home rule for the Jews in Palestine. It was therefore necessary to create a Jewish military force to help the British in their endeavors to take Palestine from the Turks. The formation of a Jewish regiment, the Zion Mule Corps, and later on the 38th, 39th, and the 40th battalions of the Royal Fusiliers should be seen in this light. It became known as the Jewish Regiment. So here there is a calculated move, realpolitik one, which actually hopes for a future redemption and perhaps independence. In China, again, a story which is not very well known, even not to quite a few Chinese, paramilitary armies of close to 175,000 young men was mobilized and sent to Europe under the horrible and humiliating conditions of the time. I'm talking about mobilizing young men between the ages of 16 to 60. They served in the killing fields in France, worked in the trenches, cleared mines, worked in various dangerous assignments, and only a fraction of those half workers, half soldiers, survived the horrors of that terrible war. Not to mention the dreadful ocean journeys from China to Europe and back, in which quite a few died. Incidentally, this expedition, Chinese in France, is the very seed, if you so wish, or the basis of the Chinese community in France even today. In both cases, and I'm still talking about the Great War, the First World War, the checks written by the victorious powers were only partially honored. The Paris Peace Conference proved to be a great disappointment and even humiliation as far as the Chinese were concerned. It is in this context, and of course the Chinese present here know it very well, that we should analyze the May 4th movement of 1919, which is the very beginning of the modern Chinese national movement. The disappointment was great, and one can dwell on that a little bit more later. Or in Palestine, the growing discontent with the British, which led eventually to anti-British sentiments and resulted in an uprising with, later on, 3 underground movements attempting to fight the occupiers and force them out of the Holy Land. This was a genuine anti-imperialist movement, and it is important to realize that this was in light of expectations and hopes concerning the First World War and promises made by the British and others. Yet, as we all know, the two national movements faced a difficult dilemma. They could not go to war against the European powers, especially the British, as they would have wished to do? And aside from the ungrateful and exploitative colonial powers, the storm brewing in Europe and in East Asia resulted in the emergence of even worse enemies, that is to say, the Nazis and the Japanese militaries. In other words, the two national movements were caught in an impossible situation whereby they could not fight those whom they wanted to fight, mainly the British, because of the other, what I called here, the brewing storm, the gathering storm in both Europe and East Asia, Nazism and Japanese militarism. Now they were forced, in fact, to compromise with the colonial power whom they despised. In fact, they were obliged to collaborate with them. After all, a greater menace had to be confronted. Thus, both national movements has to strike a balance. In my research, I have come across a few examples of the dilemma faced by the national movements. One of them is the well-known, and in fact I have written in my book about it. It is the Xi'an incident of December 1936, whereby Chiang Kai-shek actually kidnaps, in fact, Jiang Zuoliang kidnaps Chiang Kai-shek because there is a deep disagreement within the Chinese nationalist movement as what is the right step to take. Everyone in China has gone up on the story, so I shall not repeat these fascinating details. Suffice is to say that the kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek by Jiang Zuoliang and Yang Huchang marked an important disagreement within the Chinese national movement. They could not decide who they should fight first. Who was their fiercest enemy, the Japanese, who invaded their land, or the communists, who threatened their values and betrayed their national interests? So was the case in Palestine, because, of course, the majority thought that we should side with the British and collaborate with them, but we have to remember that at least 1.5 undergrounds thought otherwise, that we should in fact fight the British. And in the case of the Stern Gang or the Lehi, the idea was that no matter what, we have to fight the British, even if we have to collaborate with the Nazis. And this was one of Abraham Stern's idea. And that maybe again, this is less known, that he expected the Nazis to actually manage to cross Egypt into Sinai and come to Palestine, just as to do away with the British. But this is a fascinating story by itself. It should be pointed out that the Japanese claimed that they were China's saviors. Who but they could offer liberation from European conquest and humiliation? Who else could fight the foreign devil? The white man's imperialism. And this is really the note which they played and used very often. Chiang Kai-shek believed that the Japanese were nothing but a skin disease. The battle, the treatment can wait. The battle against them could wait, indeed. The communists, on the other hand, were the real enemy, nothing less than cancer at the very heart of the Chinese nation. The generals who rebelled against Chiang Kai-shek naturally thought otherwise. There were, of course, disagreements concerning the character of New China. Should it be part of the Marxist family of nations and thus governed by socialism, Or should China uphold Sun Yat-sen's ideas and ideals as defined by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and other heirs? In New Israel, there were also quite a few streams of political thought. I shall not go into them all. The point I would like to make is that even during Israel's 1948 war, there were fundamental ideological disagreements. One of them dealt with the conflict with the surrounding Arabs. In a way, very little has changed since then. The nation is still divided and polarized on this issue. Ben-Gurion was never kidnapped by our 1948 generals. But crucial disagreements did exist. And when I conducted my research on Jiang Zuiliang, I asked myself why something similar to the Xi'an incident, in other words, the capturing or kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek, never occurred in Israel, and Ben-Gurion was never kidnapped. And I made some inquiries about it, a sort of counterfactual history, because at a certain moment I wasn't happy about the fact that nothing happened to him. We were on the verge of civil war in June 1948. I'm not talking now about the Jews and Arabs, but I'm talking about the Jews amongst themselves, between themselves. I'm referring to here, for example, to June 1948, the Altalena affair. A violent argument broke out at sea close to Tel Aviv shore. A military confrontation between the newly created Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, and the Irgun, one of the undergrounds. A Jewish paramilitary group, formerly anti-British, but now opposed to the legitimate Israeli government. The confrontation focused on a cargo ship, the Altalena, which had been loaded with weapons and fighters by the independent Irgun organization, the opposition, but arrived during the murky period of the Irgun's absorption into the IDF. Ben-Gurion could well have been kidnapped on that occasion. He adamantly refused a request by senior officers such as Yitzhak Tabenkin, for example, and now I'm referring to another incident, to take military